Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios. And if you guys have been following this channel for a while, or even a short while, you might kind of know that I tend to speak kind of negatively about oil paints. Because I'm an acrylic painter, that's what I do. Not really a big fan of oils in the long run, but a couple of years ago that kind of shifted a little bit for me. I went from really hating oils to actually starting to understand what they're good and useful for. So here's a little story about how I changed my mind about using oil paints. So first, let's take a little brief history on why I hated oils in the first place. Well, I didn't start with oils. They weren't my first painting medium. Acrylics were. I got a starter set when I was 10 years old, fell in love with it, worked with them ever since. I grew up watching Bob Ross on PBS, and I loved his painting techniques, the traditional wet-on-wet oil. But what I found when I started using acrylics was that technique didn't really work with acrylics. So I was frustrated in that sense, but at the same time I just started coming up with workarounds, things that I can do that produce the same effect and the same look, but aren't the same way that he paints, because obviously you can't paint a big thing of white and then go over top of it with all these other colors in acrylics, because by the time you do that, the white you put on in the first place has now dried. Then in working with acrylics for so long, oils at some point just kind of became mentally inaccessible to me. I actually do remember getting a batch of my aunt's old oil paints when I was about 13, and that box was promptly taken away from me by my parents, and I was told, "You're not ready for these paints yet." And I think that's probably what mostly solidified my hatred towards oils. Don't get me wrong though, as much as I am still kind of mad about having all those paints taken away from me, they were kind of right. So fast forward to 2010 when I took a painting class in college. This is the point where things started to change a little bit. I took a painting class kind of just for fun, since I was coming out of one college program going into another. Kind of needed to fill some time, and I'm like, let's take a painting class. I already know how to paint, mostly. But let's go for it. And this particular professor said, hey, you got to use oils. Because you're used to acrylics, I want you to use oils. I'm like, crap. Now I have to use oils. But I got the alternative to use the water mixable oils, specifically the ones from Winsor & Newton. Now this was a shift, because now I can, like, wait a minute, I don't need linseed oil, I don't need mineral spirits or whatever to work with this. So this was a bit of a shift. So I was like, hey, this will be maybe a little bit easier, a better transition for you. And so I was able to do this painting with it. Definitely a learning experience. Not my best work, but definitely a shift, because now I could blend that sand in the sky, and I could do this in a more relaxed way. And I was like, huh, this isn't as horrible as I ever thought it was. Also around that same time, I picked up just like a starter set of regular Utrecht oils from my local Blix. Actually, I think it was still the Utrecht store back then. And I was like, you know what, let's just stick these in the studio, maybe do a painting with them. I did that painting with them, because I was like, well, I don't want to drag out brushes and do all this stuff. So let's put them on a palette, mix with a knife, and do that. And interesting little experimental piece, and I think that piece is still buried in my archives somewhere. But it was actually kind of fun to do that, because I took the brush work out of it. I was like, you know what, maybe this isn't that bad. And then I set the piece in the corner, and it took like 6 months for it to dry, because I painted super thick, and that's not what you're really supposed to do with oils. Now after that class in 2010, fast forward a little bit, about 6 months to mid-2011. At that point I had my acrylics, as I always did, and then I had those water mixable oils that I had for that class. Didn't use them since, did that one painting, or I think two. I think I had to do a portrait or something, which thankfully that piece does not exist anymore. But I still had the paints, and I was like, okay, either these are going to sit in my studio until they dry out in 20 years, or I can try and do something with them. So I took the brush out of the equation. I put dabs of this paint down onto a piece of watercolor paper, took a Kleenex, just rubbed it in circles, creating this sort of simple, soft, blended technique, and then painted my acrylics on top of that. And I was like, this looks neat. And that actually sparked a 2 to 3 month long painting series of what I called the Bob in Space series. That particular series was me focusing on color. And it's really just a love letter to my love for color, my love for color in work and pieces, and it allowed me to push different color combinations, I feel, somewhat to their limit. Towards the end of that series, I started doing pieces that I was like, okay, they're like an orange and a purple or something together. I'm like, that doesn't really look quite right. I think I've pushed things a little bit too far. But I learned a lot about color schemes and combinations by doing that series of pieces. Now another jump ahead in time, and we've got 2015 when I uploaded the Everything You Need to Know About Oils video. Sometime between, I think, 2013 and 2016, I was doing most of those videos, just tackling different art mediums and talking about everything that a beginner would need to know about before you start jumping into them. Now I was like, well, I don't know a ton about oils. I just use the water mixable ones, and that's about all I know. So I contacted a fellow YouTuber and friend, Thad Taylor, who has a YouTube channel called Thad Taylor Art, though I don't think he uploads a ton of stuff anymore. But he, at that point in time, was going to art school and primarily doing oil paint. So I'm like, hey, can you help me out with this? And he did. Gave me a whole bunch of pointers. I gave him like a rough outline. He rewrote the entire outline for me, pretty much. In doing that video, I was like, well, there's a lot of stuff I don't know. Maybe it's a good idea for me to have a look into this. Now, this is where things start to shift a little bit more. Enter 2017 or 18 now. Honestly, I'm not sure. I kind of lose track. And I found a video on YouTube talking about the R&F oil pigment sticks. It was mostly just a product plug, but it was this artist doing this thing and smearing this paint around, and it's like, this is oil paint. Every bit as wet as what would be in a tube. And I was like, huh. So I picked up a little starter pack of 3 of them. This is one of the ones that's left. And I was like, this completely changed my mentality of what oil paint was. This changed everything for me. Because no longer was I worried about solvents, oils, like linseed oil, oil mediums, brushes. Everything was self-contained right here. I didn't need anything else. And I was like, huh. And I could paint on canvas, I could paint on wood, I could paint on paper. And I thought back to when I did the Bob in Space series, and I was like, I bet these would work for this. And so I started experimenting, playing around with them a little bit. And then I was like, huh, you know what, these aren't gonna last that long if I play around with them that much. So I picked up another stick, and another one, and another one, and now I got a whole drawer full of them. But it was a slow build up. I wasn't buying a set and then not using the set. I was getting one at a time, slowly, saying like, do I want to play with these more? And I did. And I was like, these really are a bit of a game changer. Because again, you take all of the complicated stuff, all of the complications out of oil painting, and just boil it down to basically working with a crayon, more or less, then it changes. And I have the flexibility to still use them with a brush, but I don't have to. And that's what changed things. Now, shortly after starting to dive into these pigment sticks, I was like, you know what, my friend Jim would really love this stuff. And I was starting to think, oh, well, see how Jim's doing. And it turns out he wasn't doing well. It turned out that November, I think 2018 now, that he passed away. And I was like, well, crap. I was going to have fun painting with him in the studio, and now I can't. But one thing that he taught me back in 2014, actually, when I interviewed him, was a technique that he did where he would put oil paint down and buff it over top of an acrylic painting. I actually demoed this on the channel a couple of years ago after he died. And I was like, wait a minute, I do have oil paint. I have 1 tube of oil paint, which I actually bought sometime after that interview, and it sat in the studio for 5 years, or 4. And I was like, huh, I do have oil paint, and I can start playing with it in a tube. And sometime after that, I did that technique, and I was like, I bet this would work with other colors. So I started picking up some other colors here and there, like I think I picked up a transparent red iron oxide and a yellow ochre. And I was like, it's not, like now at the point I'm like, I'm starting to build a set unknowingly. And it's like, maybe I should actually try to do an oil painting or some version of an oil painting, or actually try to do this. And again, shortly after he died, not only did I have that paint and did that technique, I also got his old brushes. Now, suddenly, mind the backlighting, I have all these brushes that I could oil paint with. Not that I couldn't oil paint with my brushes before, but generally you're not supposed to mix your oil and acrylic brushes because get any residual oil into your acrylics and you kind of have a mess. But now I have a whole set of oil brushes. And I don't have to worry about that anymore. I don't have to worry about brushes being a barrier. I don't have to worry about the paint being a barrier. and I don't have to worry about being in my parents' basement and stinking up their house as a barrier. Suddenly all the barriers are broken down, and I can actually play with oils now in the way that I probably could have if I'd spent more time with them and been more serious about them when I was a kid. So fast forward again to March of this year, 2020, right before the big pandemic sort of hit the US, I was working on a birthday present for my mom. It was a portrait of the dog that we recently lost, very old dog. That's what happens with dogs. And I was like, she was bugging me for this dog portrait since I was like 14. So let's do a dog portrait as a memorial. So I did that. I did the whole thing, brushwork and acrylic, and I was like, you know what this would look really good with? Oil. It would look really great to color this with oil. So at this point now I had actually a starter set with oil, I had all the old tubes, and I had the pigment sticks. So I'm like, you know what, let's do it. Let's do a whole colorization of this piece in oils. And I did, and it turned out awesome because I took my time. And I suddenly realized, like, this is what oil painting is. It's not acrylic painting. And I know that seems silly to be like, oh, of course oil painting isn't acrylic painting. But I had always had a problem with transitioning from one to the other because I didn't understand how much slower of a process oil painting is. I think a large part of this was just my own maturity of the whole painting process. Not just maturity in the sense of I know more stuff, but also just I'm older. I know how to take my time with projects where I didn't 10, 15 years ago when I was working. So it makes sense when my parents are like, hey, you're not ready for oil paints yet, because I was just running through paintings. Now I can actually sit down and take my time and enjoy the process more than I did way back then. Now I'm not doing full-fledged oil paintings at this point. However, I am treating them like a finishing medium. A lot of times I'm painting down an acrylic undercoat and then doing a lot of my blending and detail work on top of that with the oils. So for me, I'm not so totally going into oils now, but I know what they're useful for. And for me, they're actually sometimes really great for finishing paintings. And again, a lot of this has to do with my own maturity as well as just experience. Because I now know I can look at a piece and go, this would be better suited for oils. The techniques are better suited for oils, and the idea is better suited for oils. The overall look is just going to look better with oils. But again, I didn't make a total 180-degree shift from hating oils to loving them now. I still don't love oils, but I know what they're useful for, and I know I can use them, where before I was like, I don't even want to touch them, get these things away from me, throw them away, I don't want them. I'm not that extreme anymore. So rather than 180, it's more like a 160. Not switching to oils by any means, but I understand them more now, and I know what they can do, and I know how I use them, and that's, I think, a really valuable thing. And that shift from 10, 15 years ago, hating oils, never wanting to touch them, to now having them in my studio as a regular set, kind of important and kind of a big deal. In addition to all of this other good stuff about not being afraid of oils anymore and not totally hating them anymore, much in the same way that I learned to paint with acrylics and learned to get acrylics to do what I wanted them to do, I adapted. I found ways to get oils to do what I wanted them to do. One of the biggest things was dry time. And that's the biggest difference really between oils and acrylics is dry time. Forget the extra mediums, forget the solvents. It's the difference between waiting a day for your paint to dry or a couple hours for acrylics and waiting 2 weeks to 6 months for your paintings to dry when you're using oils. And the pigment sticks were a stepping stone for that because it didn't matter that I needed to give them a long time to dry. Also, they have a dryer stick, colorless blender and dryer. Kind of took me back to my days when I used colored pencils more, and there's a colorless blender for that, but they're already dry, so that's not really the same thing. But having the ability to speed up the drying time with oils, and that's always been a thing, don't get me wrong. It's not a new thing that you can speed up the drying time, but it was always a little bit out of reach for me for that way. At the same time, I also roughly found, I think a friend of mine actually told me about this stuff, Gamlen's Galkid Light. This stuff is what really, when I'm using oil paints, I'm using this stuff a lot. Kind of a thin, oily medium like everything else. I will note, if you get some of this stuff, make sure the cap's on tight, because if you let it loose, it turns into jello, or jelly, or just resinous garbage. And this stuff takes the drying time of oils down from roughly 2 weeks, or a couple of days to 2 weeks for drying in between layers, down to like a day or two, depending on your painting environment. So it just like cut all of that problems, all the problems off for me by using this and usually a little extra mineral spirits. So now I've just adapted it. I've took what I thought oil painting was, which when I was younger, totally different thing. And I learned about the paint. I learned what it could do. I started experimenting here and there and started grabbing techniques to make the paint do what I wanted it to do, not what I was afraid that it was going to do without my consent. So that's just my little story about how I kind of changed my mind about using oil paints. Again, didn't do a total 180. I'm not suddenly an oil painter now. I'm still an acrylic painter. I would never give that up for anything. But I know how to use oils, where I didn't before. And now that I know how to use them, and I learned how to use them, I don't hate them. And that's what's important. So if you don't know about a medium, or you think you hate a medium, use it. Don't limit yourself. Don't force it out and be like, I hate this, I'm never going to use this. Not until you really try it. And that's really the advice I'm giving for you guys this week. So if you enjoyed this little story, hit that like button, get subscribed if you're not already, if you want to keep learning with me here. Keep on creating, and this has been from Underblock Studios, and I will see you guys next time. That was a longer story than I thought it was. Really, I don't know, I just feel like I had to tell that.